Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am your host, Tylor, who knows these books and is really, really excited for like 3 years from now when I can talk about them without having to censor myself every sentence. And I am joined by Greg, who is free and clear and can say whatever he thinks about these books. So what did you think about these 3 chapters, which I don't think real spoilers? You got your wish, and we have multiple different characters across the chapters. How do you feel about this?
I mean, it's a clear case of ignorance is bliss. I don't know what's coming in 3 years, so I can just talk about whatever I want, and I'm pretty satisfied. And even though I assume we'll reach new heights that you are hopelessly comparing current moments to, but this was a pretty fun week. I will only dibs a called it because I correctly identified which of the 3 chapter titles was a tavern. And
You are
that's all that
correct.
matters. That's all that matters to me. So I guess you're not the only one who knows about Wheel of Time, Tylor.
I definitely would not have thought that was the name of an inn the first time I read these books. You are doing significantly better than I did. That being said, I know so much more than you right now, and this is the only subject where I can say that. Any kind of overarching thoughts about these chapters before we just dive in? We've got a kind of lot to cover, even though it wasn't that much in terms of the plot moving forward.
I think I'll just say they were not what I expected after last week. Last week felt like a turning point and like, wow, here comes a major plot line. And then this was like, just kidding. Back to
Yeah.
normal. So, and that's offered without judgment. I don't really, I'm not even sure if that's a positive or a negative. It just was not what I expected. So, but let's get into specifics because we do have people who don't want to read the chapters or have us spoil anything until we summarize them. So, we are, of course, this week covering 3 chapters. Chapter 10, Figs and Mice. Chapter 11, The Nine Horse Hitch. And Chapter 12, An Old Pipe. Tylor, would you please start us off with some figs and mice?
Absolutely. That sounds like a really terrible appetizer at a Michelin star restaurant. Elaine wakes as she is being carried up some stairs, but Rondé Makura says that fork root will stop her from channeling and stop her from moving, and so Lucy, the girl who is with her, doesn't need to be worried. She is... It's clear that Elaine is worried about both the White Cloaks and the Black Aja as being places where she could potentially be turned into, and then she witnesses as the women bring Nynaeve up into the room next. Makura sets an hourglass and tells Lucy to dose them by the time that there is no more sand in the hourglass, and that will keep them able to walk until they can be sent away, but will prevent them from channeling or doing anything to get away. At this point, Makura leaves to send some pigeons to someone unnamed. Nynaeve is trying to channel. It's very obvious in her face, and it becomes obvious that Lucy is not paying the best attention because she is a bit late, and they eventually are able to talk and almost seem to make it before they are dosed again and immediately fall asleep. They wake up, and Nynaeve is already sweating by the time that Elaine wakes because she is trying so hard to channel, and Elaine thinks that she will be queen someday and redoubles her effort so she is not outdone by someone like Nynaeve. At this point, the door is about to open, and it is getting late once again, and this time it is Tom. Nynaeve tells him that Lucy isn't the threat, and Tom helps Nynaeve into the next room. Rondé Makura apparently got away, but Elaine says that she can't let too many people know that she works with Aes Sedai, and so it's unlikely that she will tell a large number of people what is going on here. Nynaeve seems irritated that Tom and Julian left camp, but Tom is kind of pointedly ignoring her. Julian eventually enters with Ronde Makura captive, and they put her with Lucy. Ronde says that she has orders, but she won't say from who. At this point, Tom threatens to sick Julian on her, and he lists a number of common items that he will use to torture her, and she immediately kind of breaks and gives in. She says that she sends letters to Tar-Valon, but denies being or working with dark friends. She claims that she was given a description of Elaine and told to capture her by any means on an order from the Amerlin. She apparently planned to smuggle them to the Yellows, feigning illness, and she gives them the real message, which was, of course, what we learned in the previous chapter, that the tower must be whole. Tom ties up these women, or ties up the two women, and then Elaine argues with herself about whether or not Tom is a good match, given how heroic he seems, thinking that her old nurse Linny would disapprove. Julian reveals that he asked for random items to let the women's imagination run wild and didn't actually have a plan for how to torture the people, and says that he once asked for figs and mice to break someone. Elaine thanks Tom and says she understands why people need warders now, and then we get a quick primer on the Ajas, which I thought was actually the most detailed one we've gotten so far. Tom says that few practice medicine this near the White Cloaks, and that it's actually men who study herbs, and the girls don't understand the message that they've been given, and it doesn't make sense why the Amerlin would want to bring them back, given that they think the Amerlin is the one who sent them away. Tom seems to kind of dismiss this, saying that he doesn't know why Aes Sedai do anything, and then Nynaeve decides they must disguise themselves. They swap to a coach, and they dye Elaine's hair. Then, for the first time in a long time, we go third-person omniscient, and everyone in town is surprised when the coach with a new driver pulls up and leaves. People kind of knock at the door and eventually find Lucy and Ronde knocked out, and immediately take the money and run away to get away from their mother and their wife, which I thought was very funny. And then finally, Ronde does wake and sends 2 pigeons, one to Tar-Valon and a second to the west, and then a copy is made by another woman who sends the bird to a third unnamed location. Figs and Mice. Weird name for this chapter, but it wrapped up very neatly all of the hanging threads from the previous chapter. You already gave your kind of general overview. This felt like it was too neat of a wrap-up. How did you feel about the execution of that, given that this was very much like a 2-chapter caper, in, out, nothing else goes on?
Yeah, I mean, not to jump to the end first, but the 2 things that stood out, my favorite thing in the chapter was this very cool kind of spycraft moment at the end. That's not what they call it. What do they call it in Spy World? I haven't read my John Le Carré lately. I'll look it up while you're talking next. But this idea that she sends the 2 notes and they had paper underneath so that they could capture the message, and then they send another one. Like, that was like a nice little bit of intrigue and a nice bit of, looking forward. Now, you mentioned that was omniscient there at the end, which I will definitely forget by the time we play this game, the game at the end of the book. But I can only imagine that was to keep hidden whoever is this mysterious third party, right? Like, that's kind of the character who it would make the most sense for it to be, and it is not them. So I really liked that. And then, the central kind of joke of the chapter with the figs and mice and the cooking oil and salt, that just worked well. Like, it gave me a good chuckle. I saw it coming a mile away when he said it. Like, I'm like, there's nothing he's going to do with that. But like, it totally worked for me. So I liked those 2 moments a lot.
I really like this moment, both because, as you say, you kind of see the punchline coming, and yet it's still kind of enjoyable to watch the characters go through it, but also because I think this perfectly highlights the difference between Robert Jordan and George R.R. Martin. Because Robert Jordan had a torture scene in which someone threatens to torture someone and doesn't, and George R.R. Martin had a scene where mice are actually used to rip someone open. One of these books is much better for, anyone under the age of 40 than the other. I'm just saying.
Well, we have a mutual friend who's currently working his way through Game of Thrones, which, all due respect, I did them. They're good. I don't understand why anybody does it now, because they're really so messed up by the TV show, and they're messed up by all that. And like, as I have previously said, I'm not an expert on fantasy. I barely read any. But one of the things that I'm appreciating more is as I read this series, which, even before we started this project, I kind of held up as like, that's for the serious fantasy people. Like that's what those people like. It is slowly making me dislike a lot of the other fantasy I've read, because things get too technical, things get, too gross, if you're George R.R. Martin, or particularly if you're the show. And so I do think, it's a silly point, but I think you're right to point out that, like, there's something sophisticated about exactly how this hits. And I'm curious to see, again, since I'm not widely read in fantasy, if we can, if I, jump into kind of more modern fantasy, is it people working in the shadow of Robert Jordan and kind of following his model with that? But I really liked kind of all of that, and I guess I'll offer the transition back to the beginning. Since I'm mentioning Prestige TV, the other Prestige TV show that was on my mind was Breaking Bad, and I was thinking specifically of Hector Salamanca, who is a character who is essentially fully paralyzed except for a finger he can use to ring a bell. And the actor is incredible at, like, showing rage in his eyes and managing to keep his, face still because of the character's paralysis, and, like, emoting, like, just this absolute fury. And that was all I could think about with Nynaeve in this opening section. And we know how powerful she is when she can't, when she's angry. You wouldn't like her when she's angry. And we know how powerful that is. So to have that kind of opening imagery, like, really worked for me, and I really enjoyed that part.
Yeah, I really liked the moment where Elaine notices that Nynaeve is trying so hard to channel, and her immediate reaction is to think, like, Nynaeve is so much stronger than me, both in the power and just in terms of, like, her dedication to keep going. And then Elaine almost gets mad at herself for having that revelation. She's like, no, Linny would tell me that I am stronger than this and I need to not talk bad about myself. And this is like the 87th time that Linny has been invoked in Elaine's head, so we need to acknowledge that name. But two, I think it's kind of a fun moment to see her both acknowledge, yes, she is behind where Nynaeve is, but that doesn't mean she can't try just as hard as Nynaeve does.
And I think I'll just throw in the thought here that I really enjoyed that this was from Elaine's perspective, kind of for that reason, because I think there's less characterization to be had in Nynaeve. If it were a Nynaeve chapter, it would be like, yes, Nynaeve is very angry and doesn't like kind of losing control, and we know this about her. So to see Elaine kind of positioning herself, it's a nice counterpoint to those moments I shouted out last week, which were where, Nynaeve was recognizing Elaine's skills, right? And was kind of doing a game recognized game kind of head nod in my mind of like, yes, girl, you're doing well. And so this is like the opposite, where it's like, Elaine trying to model herself and trying to rise to that level.
Yeah, and I like that reference to the previous chapter where Nynaeve was kind of building up Elaine, because it's the exact opposite of what she does to Tom, right? Being mad at the person who just rescued you because he didn't stay in camp like you said, that is classic Nynaeve. And that, I think, is the one moment where we do lose a little something being in Elaine's head rather than Nynaeve's, because there is nothing funnier to me than reading Nynaeve berating someone for something she knows is wrong, when we get to hear her say she knows it's wrong in her head. And we do miss out on that. But I think you're right. Elaine is the right choice for POV in this section.
She would have tugged her braid and crossed her arms over her breasts. Like, we know the moves. We know.
That is accurate. I don't have anything else in this early section. The last thing that I really have a note on is kind of the dramatic irony of the girls not being able to figure out what is going on with the Merlin calling them back and sending them away, whereas we, the readers, know there are two different Merlins, and so this makes perfect sense. Did that land for you, or was there anything else in this kind of section of the chapter before we get to the omniscient section that you appreciated?
Well, I really did like that a lot as well. And that has, I think, across all these strands, continues to be my favorite part of this opening section of this book, that it's not just straightforward, that the deliciousness of us kind of getting to worry where the characters are confused, we know, or in the Rand and Moraine strand, knowing they're sending a whole bunch of powerful objects to some evil is really, really fun within that. It did make me remember an irrelevant but maybe future relevant question, which is the letter the women are currently carrying that says they have their permission to do whatever. Is that signed Siuan or is that signed Amerlin Seat? I couldn't remember in the moment.
I don't recall off the top of my head. I know it says the Merlin Seat in all the titles, but I can't remember if it is Siuan Sancha, the whatever, or just the Merlin Seat. That's a good question.
Well, I guess you don't know everything about Wheel of Time. No problem at all on that question. Second one is, I just want to make sure I confirm with you and that we confirm with our listeners kind of who this pair is working for, right?
Yes.
So this pair of, they are not Aes Sedai. They are just helpers. They're ears and eyes out in the world.
Yep.
They are working for a yellow.
Correct.
And that yellow is still in Tar Valon, as far as we know. That's where the messages are being sent.
Yes.
And what is that yellow's name?
I don't know whether it's given. I don't think we learned the name of the head of the yellow's eyes and ears.
Okay. So, but we are to assume that they are doing... I guess this boils down to the question of, are they evil or do they think they're doing the right thing? And it seems a little unclear in my mind, although I'm not the best reader, as we've demonstrated in 200 episodes at this point, I assume.
I want to take that question and mash it up with the discussion of the final moment in the chapter, right? The pigeons.
Okay.
Right? Because I think you're exactly right to say one of the pigeons that this woman, Rande Makura, sends goes to Tar Valon. And that seems to suggest that she is still loyal to the people in Tar Valon, to Elida. The interesting thing to note is that when we're looking at the map, the other pigeon that she sends goes to the west. And that is an odd direction, because if we think about where the girls are, they're kind of like down in the Amadisia Terabon border, if you're in your map, down kind of in the bottom left corner. And that means if it's going west, it is very likely going to Terabon or Falm or Tanchico. And those feel like odd destinations that don't seem to have any association with anyone that we're really familiar with, right? So that's what makes me wonder. I don't think they are Black Aja necessarily, unless they're sending that letter. It could potentially be going to one of the Black Aja who we left in Tanchico in the previous book. But if it's not that, it's also possible it's just going to someone else to the west who is out in that direction. It's worth noting the third pigeon flies in another direction. The reason that I'm highlighting west is because in the next chapter, we learn some information about where some people are, and it is not west of this chapter. So that, I think, is relevant, even though I can't say more until the following chapter.
For listeners that tuned that out, what Tyler's saying is there's not a lot of west on the map from here. And so what comes to mind with that, I actually made that connection too, so I just want to slide in on that. Yeah. And then note that I always am conscious of the fact that west there's not a lot of the continent west, but we know there are people to the
Yes.
far west. And, I don't know about messenger birds crossing an ocean, but, we do have the Shan-Chan forces out there.
Well, and it's worth noting, even if we're not going all the way to the continent of Shan-Chan, the Shan-Chan who retreated from Falm are also in a group of islands to the west of Tanchico. So it's the same general direction and much more feasible for a pigeon.
And very good clarification on my question. I think I am going to reframe it as, I'm curious if when they report to Tar-Valon, they think they're helping the good forces of Tar-Valon or the negative forces in the Black Aja as a part of that. I did flip real quick while you were speaking, and the name that is given that was stuck in my mind is that they get orders from Narenwin Barda, who they say is working at a tavern, and that person at the tavern in Tar-Valon takes it to the tower. So I think you were accurately remembering that we don't really know who in the tower they're reporting to because we have this middle step. But I was confused because I'm like, no, I swear it said a name. So that's where.
No, that makes perfect sense. Absolutely. You mentioned the yellow, which is great because I have a game. I think we are now at the point in this series where we have gotten a decent description of all of the Ajas, save maybe one in at least one or two places, including a decent rundown of everyone except for two in this chapter. I want to say a color and see how good you are feeling with your knowledge of these colors. I am going to start from the ones I think you are most likely to get and work my way down to, oh God, no. Let's start with the one that is mentioned in this chapter. What do you think the yellows do?
Heal, right?
Yes.
Aren't they the healers?
Exactly. And that's spot on. That's all you need to know about them. Nailed it. What do the reds do?
They hunt down dudes, threatening men. They take them down.
That is accurate. 100%. What do greens do?
They get horny with multiple warders. But
that's half of what they do, yeah.
I know, but the other half is that they are the combat, and I think that was new information this chapter, that Elaine had pictured herself becoming green because they are the warrior Aja.
Yeah, the idea that Elaine is kind of taking that choice to prepare herself for the last battle, I thought was really interesting and is kind of the moment that made me think, hey, I think we know enough to answer these questions. Now we're getting into the more difficult ones. What do the blues do?
Blues are Gryffindor. They have courage and they believe in a cause, right? They are mentioned in this chapter as that's like they are working kind of. It reminded me a little bit of like D&D cleric or no paladin versus warrior, right? Kind of like they're a little more spiritual type than the pure kind of brute of the greens that just want to fight.
It's like an interesting mix between like being driven by a cause and also almost like they are the adventurers, right? They're the ones who go out in the world and do instead of staying in the tower and, accomplishing things there. Excellent. You're 4 for 4. Now we're getting into the really tricky ones. What do the browns do?
Browns are the scholars. They dig into the history and the knowledge to try to get answers about what's to come.
Absolutely nailed it. The last two, I'm not entirely sure whether the book has given us a lot of details, but we've got enough. What do whites do, Greg?
Whites are legislatures. They're like the Senate around Tar-Valon.
Oh, if I had given you the other one of the missing colors, you might have gotten partial credit. The whites are philosophers. They are the ones who are often kind of dedicating themselves to like pure knowledge and truth. I think this is also where mathematicians end up kind of sitting in the White Tower hierarchy. And then the last one that I'm sure has been vaguely mentioned at some point. What do the grays do, Greg?
They run Tar-Valon.
Yeah, they're kind of described as like somewhere between like lawyers and negotiators. Think of the Greys as like the UN of Tar-Valon.
All right, my off-topic mention for the day is I just want to point out I started reading a great new book that's about to be a movie this fall called Conclave, which is like about the death of a pope, and it's like and like they're going through cardinals and all that. I'm like, I don't know what any of these words mean, and so the fact that I could do that well with the fictional Aja, and I'm still like, wait, what is an archbishop versus a cleric? I don't. So all right, I'll work on my Catholicism. I will be proud of my Aja knowledge.
Very weirdly, those books will probably be extremely helpful for you in like a book and a half of Wheel of Time. Any last thoughts on the chapter Figs and Mice before we leave it behind for other characters?
No, I think the only thing I want to note in light of the conversation we were just having is that Nynaeve, Elaine, Tom, their party definitely assumes these two women were working for the Black Aja, which that's why I kind of was like, I don't know. I get nervous when characters are so easily sure without kind of interrogating it. But that's the only other note I had.
Yeah, it did seem at least Elaine seemed kind of convinced when the women protested that they weren't dark friends, but Tom certainly seemed a lot more skeptical, so I think that's a really good point. Chapter 11, the Nine Horse Hitch, which it feels a little dirty to say. Siuan lets Logain take the lead while thinking that she is using him and he is just bait for a bigger fish. They are in Murindi, which is more city-states than a true country, and the city they are in is Lugard. Logain leads them into the titular inn, and Siuan hates riding, even though she's riding Bella, the best horse in the world. Liana tells Siuan that she wants to practice her wiles, and Siuan suggests that she practice on Logain, and she agrees. At this point, Siuan goes to Min and tells her to rush inside, saying she's meeting Siuan, and then to avoid the others until Siuan returns, clearly kind of hiding Siuan's movement. She has to briefly blackmail Min, but she gets that to happen. Siuan thinks of the oddity of being old but looking young, and thinks how everyone in the crowd is kind of noticing her in a way that they wouldn't have otherwise, and she thinks there are some advantages to stilling. She thinks of a number of explicit inn names that she walks past, and then she finds an inn with a naked woman astride a horse, and the name is too vile for her to think of. She walks inside, and it is a dive. She approaches Mistress Tharn, saying that she is looking to sing and wants to be a performer. She names two songs with colors and numbers in them that are clearly some sort of code, and she is told to bare her legs. She reluctantly does so, and then is rushed into the back. Siuan is apparently used to run the eyes and ears of the Blue Aja, and knows Tharn to be an agent of the Blues, and apparently only one other agent Siuan trusted on the way here, but she vanished in Four Kings. She worries that this is going to go poorly and that so many agents seem to have vanished. Once they are alone, Tharn asks her for news of the tower, and Siuan tells her the truth about what has happened and gets the unvarnished opinion of Siuan that is not especially positive. Tharn she intuits that the Ajas have split from one another, and then Tharn gives her a cipher, Sally Dara. Siuan is excited by this, but suppresses it. Tharn is apparently still loyal to Aeldine, who Siuan did not know was her replacement as the head of the Eyes and Ears, and then Tharn tells her to stop acting so stuck up or the Aes Sedai will do it for her. Tharn compliments her figure to the crowd as they walk out, but says she was too shy, causing the entire crowd to talk about how beautiful or not she is, and causes Siuan to flee in her frustration. Siuan is so angry at the innkeeper, but also excited to have a destination, the city of Saladar, which is absolutely right on the spine of your book if you are looking at your map. This apparently is a town that is well known in the history of the Blue Aja, but not known to many others. Because she is so excited, she avoids the Children of the Light, and then is noticed because she is trying to avoid the Children of the Light, and she is mad at herself for making that mistake, and so she starts glaring at everyone as she walks on. We then switch to Min's point of view as he watches Logain kind of frown and be upset, even though he is enraptured by Liana, who also has a number of other men hanging all over her. We learn learn that Lyanna was able to diffuse a conflict between a number of the men who are potentially arguing over her, and then Min kind of idly wonders if Lyanna will teach her how to flirt, but then she thinks that she doesn't want to change herself for a man, even though she thinks she does kind of want to change herself for Rand. Siuan arrives, saying they need to go to the south now, and she says that White Cloaks may be looking for her. They walk past the Nine Horse Hitch again and talk about the name, saying that there are 8 and 10 horse hitches, but not 9, and then Min walks away, seemingly having decided that she will get some tips on flirting from Lyanna. Boy, was that a chapter about flirting for half of it, and really interesting spycraft for the other half. What did you take away from the Nine Horse Hitch?
Tradecraft. I said the wrong word before, and I did look that up while you were talking. I was like, I know spycraft's not quite right. Yes. So in the espionage industry, they call it tradecraft. Is kind of the nuts and bolts of how you're a spy. This, honestly, more than anything, this made me nostalgic for my previous trips to London, because my favorite thing to do in London is go find cool tavern names. And this chapter gave us a bunch, but also notably not the filthy one, which, again, if we're looking for differences from George R.R. Martin, that seems like one right there. So,
we do get the name of that tavern. It's just at the beginning of the next chapter.
Wow. So this was a kind of fun nothing, right? Like it was a trifle, a little kind of palate cleanser in some ways, but I did like that. I did like where we just talked about how the Elaine POV chapter helped you compare to Nynaeve. We also get a lot here that helps us compare Siuan to Elaine. Yeah. Both being, kind of identified as being essentially too stuck up to do this well because of their upbringing and of the comfortable life maybe that they've had. Siuan, I know, I think she grew up somewhere related to fish. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, it's possible.
And so it's not necessarily that she was high-born, but that has grown accustomed to the life and the power. So it works well in that way. And, I thought enough of a kind of suspense thriller about, is this also another sullied bit of informant, some kind of turncoat, but then it just kind of all works how it's supposed to, and you get some dirty jokes about her legs, so it's kind of a fun nothing.
Yeah, I think actually, as you're mentioning, kind of it feels like there should be more there. It turns out we actually skipped over the section that would have been really interesting from that perspective. In this chapter, Siuan thinks about the only other agent who she trusted, who apparently was in a town called Four Kings in Andor. We have been to Four Kings. When we were in Four Kings, Matt and Rand were in the very first book trying to make their way to Camelin, and while they were in Four Kings, Rand accidentally channeled a lightning bolt through an inn, and then shortly afterwards, Matt killed a woman who was spying on them. I think Siuan's kind of trust in her agent was very misplaced, and she may have been trusting a dark friend.
And that gets referenced here, right? The actual barn burning?
The barn burning doesn't get referenced, but
the
village does. Maybe a different barn burning. Oh, no, the barn burning that gets referenced is the one from earlier in this book where the girls got arrested.
Okay. That's a great tip, and definitely missed all of that. So that's you earning your paycheck this week. The heavy sum is on its way.
Yeah, it's $0. I'm the one who manages our podcast account. I don't want to spend too much time in the early part of this chapter, mostly because the things I have to say are about Min and Lyanna, and they get better places to shine later on. So I kind of want to just jump all the way to Siuan and the blue eyes and ears and her kind of figuring out information here. This was just an interesting scene to get to see Siuan use the benefits of her previous powerful position while also navigating being the least powerful person in a situation where she went to an inn and asked for some help. Right? Like, that is very much the opposite of what she's used to. And then, as you say, her kind of confusion about how to act in that situation gives us some fun comedy to go along with the kind of interesting character moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other key piece of that is, I would say, is that there is still privilege of her position to be used. In other words, the blues are still active. Like they have not been crushed by, the Black Aja, and that this network seems to still be working. And apparently, I trust everything that happened in this chapter, at least at this time, but apparently is giving the right message. So tell it to me like it's Star Wars. This felt like at the end of Revenge of the Sith when Obi-Wan and Yoda sneak back to the temple because somebody said a message like, come back to the temple, we'll help you. And instead, Obi-Wan and Yoda sneak in and change the signal. This is like, don't go to Tar Valon, head off, go into hiding. We've now, in other Star Wars media, heard Obi-Wan's message, which I think is very cool that we eventually got that. And here it's like somebody is still active in this network. At the moment, we don't know who, but it appears they are sending the right message to get people to safety.
And I think if we're thinking about this being Siuan being able to kind of tap into this network and figure out what messages are going to who and when, I also liked the note that Siuan is not kind of current on this network, that she didn't even know who took over for her in managing the network. And so at best, her contacts are going to be 10, 15 years old. That kind of balance of her old life is still benefiting her, but she still feels very cut off from it, I feel like is exactly where I want that character to be, like just isolated enough for it to be interesting for her to tap into what otherwise would be very interesting solutions to a lot of problems. Okay.
And that just has a nice resonance with the fact that she's jumping 10 years back in her life in that way. At the same moment, she's jumping back in her appearance and age. And that was the only other thing that really stood out to me in the early part of the chapter is, like, it is very clear that she is suddenly a young, beautiful woman. And so, is adjusting to that life and the kinds of attention that gets. I guess I'm just plugging my film podcast. We're headed into Oscar movie season, so we've been like tracking all the festivals, and there's a movie coming out later this month where Demi Moore is apparently giving the career of like her lifetime, and she gets to turn into Margaret Qualley, and it's that kind of that's like all I was thinking about here is like, I think I'm about to see a movie like this in here as she herself, and again it's Demi Moore's, it's supposed to be the same character, I think, like the details are sketchy, but it's like, she's suddenly transported back to this younger life. And so there's this weird resonance where she's lost one type of power, has this other type of power, and is trying to figure out, like, who am I now and how do I negotiate this?
And then watching her doing that, and then when it overwhelms her not knowing how to control it because she's in a very different social situation, and that kind of blows up on her in the sense of the White Cloaks paying attention to her. I thought that was a really fun way to take that kind of very internal conflict, and she is not thinking about it directly because that's not what characters do when they're in internal conflict. So Robert Jordan really effectively takes that internal conflict and makes it something external, so we can see her react to it in a way that she hadn't been when she was arguing with, Tharn in the inn. That's what clearly causes the anger, but she doesn't really get forced to confront it until she screws up in front of the White Cloaks, and that moment works really well, I think.
Yeah, I think this conversation is convincing me I liked this chapter more than I thought I did. That there's more there, than it's more of a meal than the trifle I suggested it was.
So if that's the case, Siuan gets kind of a fun little character beat mini arc in this chapter. On the other hand, Lyanna, Min, and Loghain each get like 5 or 6 sentences, but I kind of find myself having something to say about each of them anyways. I want you to kind of lead this conversation. Is there one of those characters you were most interested in, or is there anything that stood out to you in kind of the beginning and ending parts of this chapter?
Well, first, I'm just laughing because I was like, oh, good, Tyler's about to tell me some things because I have no notes on those sections. So I offer that not just as a note of my lack of preparation, but just that there's not a lot that stood out about their arcs as a part of it. I mean, It seems like Leanne is in a moment where she too is trying to understand what life outside of Tar Valon is like, right?
Yeah.
That has been cloistered in some way herself, and so is trying to figure out what this is. to her that is, well, I guess we were just talking about the power of a beautiful young woman. Like she's trying to figure out what that power is, a power that probably hasn't been used a lot in Tarvalon in the last decade.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really interesting to me is that Min is feeling separated from Rand in these chapters, but every other character has been stilled in the very recent past, or gentled in the case of Logain. And so seeing Siuan seemingly dealing with it very well, but then having this kind of emotional volatility around all of the other things she's lost, really contrasts to me with Lyanna, who is trying to replace one type of power with another, and Logain, who seems to be trying to do what Siuan is doing, but is almost failing, right? It's clear that he's like going through the motions of flirting with Lyanna, but doesn't actually kind of, by the end of the chapter, he's frowning as much as he's smiling, despite the fact that he's getting most of the attention from the woman that everyone in the bar wants attention from.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously there's like, I think what I'm about to say could be perceived the wrong way, so I'm treading carefully. But like, there's a way in which that just adds to Logain feeling a little listless, and I'm treading carefully because I'm like dangerously close to the like male equivalent of what JD Vance has been spouting. Like, you don't have to be like sexually active to have worth, and like, but to say that, you know, again, there's this type of power at work in this chapter, and because he is uninterested in it or displeased by it, it does feel like he just lacks direction, and I think it just contributes to an overall feeling that he lacks direction. Everybody's personal choices don't matter. You all have worth. It's going to be a hard fall dodging these election bullets.
You know what else doesn't have a whole lot of direction, Greg? This podcast. We're not even going on to the third chapter next. That's right. It's time to bring back one of our all-time favorite old school traditions, an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast.
Ill-advised discussion of non-visual media on a visual podcast.
You flipped those, and that's okay. In Chapter 12, we are introduced to the Seal of Gareth Brine, which is a rampaging bull with the crown of roses around its neck. It's a cool symbol that immediately I looked at it and went, oh, that must be a new one, because it doesn't have the same style as the symbols from the first 2 or 3 books. Was that your takeaway as well, or was there anything else about this bull that interested you?
I just want to bracket that you warned me that we were going to do this, and yet somehow we still both forgot that we should have done this to start the episode off. But it does work here because we can talk about it now in the context of Chapter 12 and the character, as you just did, of Gareth Brine. It did feel a little different in that so many of the ones we've talked about, we've talked a lot about balance in some way, whether that is some symmetry. God, I forgot the word symmetry. We must be at the end of our hour. So we've talked a lot about symmetry or the balance of like black and white, and we've also talked about breaking the frame. So we have a bull here that is largely dark. It does break the frame, but it is on a white square. So, you know, and I find it a little uninspiring, if I'm being honest, compared to some of the others we've studied. But it, like, even without reading it, even with the kind of wreath of roses, it just feels like it's masculine, right? It's dude time. Like, let's get some dude power in here. It felt a little like that.
I think you're absolutely right. My complaint about this is just that it feels too realistic, right? I think if we were getting this same symbol in the first book, it would have been like a stylized pictograph of a bull with a rose kind of hidden in the symbol. Now it's just, this is a fairly accurate drawing of a bull. That being said, I really love the symbolism of this for Gareth Brine, right? This character who was a general, who clearly is a leader of men, who is clearly kind of dedicated and willing to, say, go across multiple borders to track down one person who committed one crime. That person then putting on this kind of very delicate crown of thorns really tells you something about who Gareth Brine was when he kind of devoted himself to Morgaze. And then this chapter chapter really highlights how oof it hurts when those roses get taken away. I just once again need to know that all horses should win the Olympic medals, not their riders. And other than that, that's kind of what I have to say about this symbol. What do you think about this, not as a chapter icon, but as the symbol for Gareth Bryan and his house?
I like everything you just said, and the fact that the second line of this chapter involves a velvet hat just kind of underscores that, right? It's like, yes, big, tough, driven man in a velvet cap, and that kind of works in the symbol as well. I guess the only other thing I'll say about it is as I read the symbol, and this could be incorrect, but the legs of the bull have some kind of definitional muscles that are outlined. But the ribs are also there. And to me, I don't know bull anatomy terribly well, but when I see ribs on an animal, I think past its prime, not up to the full strength. And so that also works for Gareth Bryan as all the past tense you just used. Was a general, right? Was kind of the big, strong masculine. Still is formidable, but is maybe not at full strength.
No, I think that's a really good point. It's not something that I would have noticed, but as soon as you said it, I was like, yeah, that's what Robert Jordan was intending. I think you hit that nail on the head. I have nothing else to say about this image, so let's instead talk about this very short chapter, An Old Pipe. Gareth Bryan's hat is blown off by the wind, and he wants a new one anyways, so he lets it go. I can relate to that so hard. We learn that he is going to an inn known as the Wagon Seat, which has an image that causes Bryan to think it is very dirty, and that is, of course, the same inn that Siuan was in the previous chapter. Bryan enters and notes the high prices and thinks that this is kind of the chaos that is being sown by everything going on in the world. And then he learns that what I refer to as Siuan et al. Were here about a day ago. The girls leave notice, especially Liana, where everyone was commenting on kind of the wily woman. The White Cloaks apparently are moving west, but Gareth Bryan insists that it is not his problem anymore. We learn that the people who Bryan is following also went on the west road and left quickly. His men seem to think that the girls are in trouble, and so they may want to save them, but at least one of his men says that they should turn back, and it's too much trouble to go to. Gareth Bryan thinks that it's foolish, him following after these women, especially because he knows his own private reasons for doing it, but he gathers the old guard and starts to kind of make his way out of town. He seems intent on following. As he does, he learns the news that a large number of the guards in Andor are being replaced by what are being called the White Lions, who are loyal to Gabriel rather than to the throne, and we learn that the White Lions now outnumber the guards by a significant margin. Gareth Bryan once again dismisses that as not being important, but then he begins thinking about and dwelling on how he was sent away by Morghese and how cold she was and how she made it clear that he had committed treason and was not welcome back under any circumstances. He then thinks about what his sigil means. We just talked about it. At this point, he tells the story of when Siuan and Elida kind of caused Morghese to change her opinion about what was going on in Lugard, and how Bryan tried to change her opinion once this had happened, but Siuan Sancha kind of cursed him out, and he eventually had to go back and do all of the things that she wanted instead of what he wanted instead. He manages to make this into a joke for his troops and leads the men off, thinking that he will go to the pit of doom if he must to track down what he doesn't really know is Siuan Sancha. An Old Pipe is a fun chapter title because I don't actually remember encountering the pipe in this chapter, although I'm sure it was there. Just wasn't notable. What did you take away from our little bit of time with Gareth Bryan?
I think you just confirmed the one, like how I read this. So I wanted to make sure as we reviewed it that we did answer this question very clearly. So he is, and all his questions are about three women. And so he is tracking the other group, right? He is trying to track Nynaeve, Elaine, Egwene.
No. He is trying to track Siuan and Liana and Min. Because remember, in the beginning of this book, this was the barn burning where Logain had lit the barn on fire. And so those girls were put in prison and swore to work on Bryan's estate until they broke away.
Oh, whoa. Okay, I was confused who this guy was then. So I'm good on that, right? And I'm glad I asked the question then, because he does keep asking for 3 women, and I was like, oh, he might be tracking the wrong people. Especially, I think what confused me was the Andor connection. So I was like, oh, he must be hunting down the princess. So I'm glad to have that clarification. Hey, that's what happens when you read one chapter every week for endless months. I totally missed that. So, I actually, the silly comparison I want to draw is I was thinking a lot about the Muppet movie, just because I do. That's what I think about.
Why not?
Kermit, Fozzie, and I believe Gonzo at that point have a funny moment where they invite Sweetums, the giant brown Muppet, to come with them to Hollywood, and he runs to get his suitcase, and they are like, oh, I guess he didn't want to come, and they drive off in their Studebaker or some other car at that point, and then Sweetums chases them the rest of the movie trying to go to Hollywood. And so I offer that Gareth Bryan might be the Sweetums of this saga, in that I think it's meaningful that they have accidentally gotten this man to follow them, but I don't know that I don't know to what end that will, come to.
Yes, and I think that is the fun part about this plot line for me, is I don't know what Logain is entirely getting out of fleeing. I don't know what Min wants other than to get back to Rand. Siuan has plots that I am unaware of. Lyanna apparently wants to flirt and nothing else. And Gareth Bryan can't seem to puzzle out why he's doing what he's doing. This is kind of a really fun moment where all of our characters now have a destination and are barreling there at varying degrees of speed, and yet we don't know anything about why they're going or what they're doing, why they're doing what they're doing. And that's really fun to me. I really like moments where characters are doing things that make sense and have an internal symmetry, but you don't yet know what that symmetry is pointing towards. And I'm really enjoying that game, I think, with Gareth Bryan more than even the girls in the other section, even though they're the ones who have kind of the mysterious, kind of story developing about where they're going and what they're trying to do.
Well, in just a little bit of extra map talk, I assume that the key takeaway is essentially these two groups we've spent time with this week are headed towards each other, but kind of accidentally. They're not seeking each other necessarily, but one group is in the west headed east, and the other is actually kind of more central than in the east heading west. And the map lays this out. I didn't mention at the top of the Nine Horse Hitch chapter, I did note that we were in a different region, and we get a new king name checked. And I would say I was struck by the fact that all the instability mentioned is not about that king, right? Like everywhere else, it's been like there's a crisis of leadership, whereas this was all the instability seemed to be, like you alluded to in your summary, about like, oh, trade's in trouble because Terabon is messed up. And this, so it's like the effects of those outer areas affecting this more than like a crisis that has been identified in this kingdom yet.
Well, the details of the history of Murundi we get kind of suggest that it has been kind of in a mini state of crisis for hundreds of years, right? This isn't like a unified, solid country in the way that like Andor or Cairhien are. It's almost like a series of city-states that technically swear loyalty to a king, but as soon as there's not a crisis causing them to band together, they basically act like each city is its own country and kind of ignores the national law. So I think that idea, you're highlighting two things that are simultaneously true, right? There is no real crisis in Murundi, but because it isn't kind of a unified place that has like a national economy, it probably is much more susceptible to those kind of when the neighbors are going bad, you kind of falter as well, because it doesn't have the kind of cohesiveness and unity that the other countries would have to insulate them from some of that trouble across the borders.
I really wanted to identify a U.S. state that was akin to, but nothing is coming to mind. I was going to take pot shots at somewhere.
It's the story of the Balkans after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Like the smaller countries really struggled in the immediate aftermath of that collapse because they didn't have the kind of nationalized support structure that had happened in the Soviet Union, right? If you are the tiny little piece of the Ukraine that is now independent, you're going to really struggle to provide that kind of governance. That's kind of Murundi all the time, it feels like.
I'm going New Jersey. And each exit is its own little nation state, and there's no economy of New Jersey that exists. They're relying on whatever's happening in New York and whatever's happening in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. If you're from New Jersey and take great offense to that, find us online on social media. I probably won't see it.
I almost just, one of my favorite networks is Dropout, and they have a show right now where people just make presentations about dumb things. And one of the running jokes is that every single one of those presentations, someone says, if you have complaints, send it to, and then one of the guys' names at dropout.com. And I almost was just like, yeah, send it to Grant O'Brien at dropout.com.
No, that's helpful and that's interesting. And I think we're in the kind of summarizing the experience of these chapter up point of this episode. And I will just say enjoyable. I think very much still feels like these plots are starting up and getting going more than these are very strong developments in these plots. So I think you started the episode by saying we don't get a ton of plot, but I didn't have a bad time despite that. And I think that's a credit to Robert Jordan and his choices in doing exposition and so on.
I think that's exactly right. These are chapters that move things along in the sense that they give us all the information we'll need for things to actually move along later on. And that's why Robert Jordan needs to bring out a bunch of really great tricks, right? The fact that these chapters are called Figs and Mice, which is a lie that someone tells, the Nine Horse Hitch, which is the name of a dirty inn, and an old pipe, which is a thing that I don't know was mentioned in the chapter. I think that highlights for you that what these chapters are about is not what these chapters are about, right? They're as much about the dirty inn names and how Lyanna is flirting as they are about what actually happens in them, and I think that's why I like them. They work because they're kind of not about much, and that lets the weird little details of Fantasyland shine through. And that's kind of what I want in a fantasy book sometimes, is just it to feel like a lived-in world that I can read 10 pages about and nothing needs to happen. I can just have fun in it.
Well said, and I will just only add to that to say that I was surprised to already see we're past the 25% mark, I think, in this book. You know, we're cruising right along where we passed page 200 in my mass market paperback. I am not sensing our usual kind of tick, 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 tick uphill and then like one giant. It's kind of like everything's in motion, and I'm interested to see where they all go. But after 2 weeks of 3 chapters, we're taking it a little slower next week. So next week we will be covering chapter 13, A Small Room in Sienda, and chapter 14, Meetings. Because my real life is not filled with enough meetings. We have to experience fantasy meetings as well. Before I wrap it up, I just want to say, because I don't do personal plugs a lot, but I, as was clearly on my mind, I've been doing a lot of prep for my movie podcast of late. So if you like what I have to say, you can find me talking about movies over on the Long Take Review, which is available wherever you get major podcasts. It's a really fun time of year. I know this is the time of year Tylor kind of checks back in. He doesn't do a lot of summer blockbusters, but is interested in the kind of festival fare and the Oscar movies when we eventually get to there, and that's where we are kind of starting it up. So Tylor doesn't know this, but I frequently plug Through the Glass Columns over there, so I figure I should return the favor, and I can only thank our listeners over here. We did see a bump in downloads for our television episodes again this year. We love them, we like them. If there were more episodes of the show to talk about, we'd do more episodes about them. I hear Rings of Power is maybe off to a little better start this season, and then we're hoping when that wraps up for the year, we finally get the next announcement for Wheel of Time season 3. But Tylor, as far as you know, they're filming. We're going.
Oh, it's wrapped. They are editing. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, and you mentioned being at about the 25% mark in terms of word count. We are at exactly the 25% mark in terms of how many weeks there are in this book. We've got some fun stuff coming up. Just maybe not immediately. Wheel of Time books take a little bit of time to get going. But will it be next week that it gets fun? Find out through the glass columns. It would have to be really through the glass columns for it to be next week, but you can see. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.